structure reflects the fact that governments do matter. So we have deputy ministers of health from the federal, provincial, and territorial level sitting on our board, but they're the minority of board members. The majority of board members are civilians, like me. And I'm one of just 2 psychiatrists on the board. We've had nurses, social workers, but also we also placed a priority on having people with lived experience on the board, as well as family members on the board. So that's the majority of people who sit on the board. What we produced ultimately was a blueprint for transforming the mental health system across Canada. Of course, it has 26 priorities, 109 specific recommendations, and with your indulgence, I'm going to read all 109 recommendations. Today, I just want to focus on one priority that I think will be of interest to you. Because, of course, all politics are local. And this is priority 3.2 in your handout if you wish to engage in responsive reading. The priority 3.2 is to increase the availability and coordination of mental health services in the community for people of all ages. So the strategy places very strong emphasis on increasing access to the full range of services, treatment, and supports when and where people need them, including peer support. And you'll see several reports on the website of the Mental Health Commission on making the case for peer support and setting up standards and accountability for peer support. But it's not enough to say, well, you know, I had that problem, I had that illness, therefore I am a peer support worker. Absolutely not. Second of all, an emphasis on evidence-based psychotherapies and clinical counseling as a critical element of the menu of services, treatments, and supports. And that the strategy acknowledges the need for equitable access for psychotherapies and clinical counseling provided by a range of qualified professionals in this country. We point out that people are simply waiting way too long for services, if they can get them at all. And that there's a strong evidence base that these services, when based on the best available evidence, are cost-effective, they improve outcomes for many people living with mental health problems and illnesses, and that other countries, because we're coming late to this, if you look at Australia and the United Kingdom, they have publicly funded systems which have declared as a priority expanding access to these services. In the United Kingdom, there's a report that came out in 2007 from the National Health Service called IAPT, Improving Access to Psychological Therapies. Anybody familiar with the IAPT movement in the UK? I see one head now. Okay. I'm telling you, look afield. Look to Australia, look to New Zealand, look to the UK, and see what you can learn from other countries that are further ahead with regard to this kind of expansion. In fact, in the UK, they publish quarterly performance indicators for improving access to psychological therapies. And indeed, I just pulled this off the web yesterday from the London School of Economics, the Center for Economic Performance, an article called How Mental Illness Loses Out in the National Health System. This is the Center for Economic Performance's mental health policy group. And so that there is a great deal of focus in the UK on meeting standards for improving access to counseling services. Not enough is being done to support innovative team-based approaches to providing these services in community mental health and primary health care networks. And indeed, if you were to ask me where I think the action is going to be in the next 5 years, it's all around primary care. That's where most Canadians go for mental health services. And that's where the opportunities exist, family health teams, family health groups, for expanding the range of services that are provided. We do place a particular emphasis in our strategy on child and youth mental health. And this is where the two-tiered access to psychotherapies is really striking when you think about the waiting lists. And you think about the waiting lists with the denominator of the age of that child. I know that in Ontario, it's nothing for children to wait 12 to 18 months for access to services, including counseling. Well, if you think that that child is 8 years old or 10 years old, that's an unacceptable fraction of their life to spend waiting. On top of that, we know that 70% of all adult mental illnesses emerge in childhood and adolescence. And there's an opportunity to intervene early and change the direction. So, strategy recommendation number 1, we increase access to psychotherapies and clinical counseling by service providers who are qualified to deliver approaches based on best available evidence. And recommendation number 2 is that we remove financial barriers for children and youth and their families to access psychotherapies and clinical counseling. Now, I should point out the strategy does not single out any one or two professions, in the same way that the strategy doesn't single out any one or two illnesses or health problems, because we knew we would be setting off major league turf wars, whether it's turf wars among the providers or turf wars among people with lived experience and their families, all of whom have separate lobby groups, all of whom were besieging the Commission for specific mention of their disease. So it's not about whether someone is a GP, a psychologist, a clinical social worker, a psychiatrist, someone with a master's in counseling or family therapy, or an OT, or a nurse with training in psychotherapy. What matters is qualifications, having them, a mechanism for accountability, and a mechanism for training. And I use the training in the broadest sense, and as you come into your own experience with a regulatory college, that training has to include mandatory upgrading of your training. It used to be said of physicians, you could date the year of graduation from medical school by their prescribing behavior, right? Because people used to kind of flatline. And you know the definition of clinical experience? You know the definition of clinical experience? Clinical experience has been defined as making the same mistake year after year with increasing levels of confidence. So it is essential that there be mandatory ongoing skill development for all health professionals. And that you are accountable not simply to your college, but to the public. You know, I've always taught my residents, and I've been teaching residents now for close to 30 years. Every single note you write in a chart should be written in a way that you're comfortable with the patient reading it, the family reading it, and a lawyer reading it. Okay? That's it's their information. It's not your information. That's the health information that belongs to that patient. And so I have never, I often get patients saying, can I read my chart? So be my guest. I always let patients read the charts. So how is this broadening of access going to happen? Well, the strategy does not offer a single point of accountability for moving forward with recommendations, and let me tell you why. Firstly, because of the reality of how health and social services are delivered differently from province to province to province to territory. And also, in part, because we don't have the authority of government. We work with governments, and you'll know in Ontario, in the last budget, a huge new investment in child and youth mental health to the extent of about $257 million. Rather, it's going to take all of us to translate the strategy recommendations into action at the government level, at the NGO level, through professional associations, through organizations of people living with mental health problems and illnesses in their family, all of us working together. So I see that in Ontario, the Transitional Council of the College of Registered Psychotherapists and Registered Mental Health Therapists is developing regulations and standards for a new regulatory college. And that's a really encouraging development, and it will or should be one of the prominent voices advocating for implementation of the recommendations in the strategy. And from the lessons learned here in Ontario, there are going to be valuable insights that will be helpful in forging the consensus that's needed to overcome some of the challenges. What are those challenges? Well, I mentioned already turf wars, right? And particularly when it comes to public dollars. As you know, there are people who have preferential access in our healthcare system to those public dollars. Right? And there will be a circling of the wagons, inevitably, and we need to both work through that and find innovative funding models. And I can tell you that even a Tory government listens closely to opportunities to save money. Let me give you an example. With our at-home chez soi homelessness project, where we're spending a lot of money to subsidize housing for people who've been psychotic and sleeping under bridges. We've already been able to show, with the evidence from the study, that for high-frequency users, the frequent flyers in emergency rooms, jails, and shelters, every dollar we invest in housing those individuals saves the system $1.56 in reduced ER, shelter, and jail costs. Well, the government loves that. This is a win for human dignity. And I can tell you, having met a number of the participants in that study in those 5 Canadian cities, who have been homeless for years, some of them, and are now decently, and I underline decently, housed. These are not flop houses. These are really nice places to live. The rest